Hi, I'm Kathy Elwood, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's session. Today, we're going to be dealing with the challenges and the complexities of cyber insurance. We're very fortunate to have with us today Trent Cooksley. He's the co-founder and chief operating officer of Cowbell Cyber. He's responsible for the strategic direction, the insurance operation, and he's built the platform and portfolio along with a wide distribution network. He's been an insurance executive and also has been a founder of 3 startup initiatives and has held positions of all different stages from getting the money to actually implementing. Before he joined Cowbell, he was head of open innovation at Markel Corporation and was also the managing director of their digital platform. In addition to that, he also has had several innovations for the industry. In fact, one of the ones I think was pretty interesting was the first pay-as-you-go insurance technology solution. So without any further from me, let me introduce to you Trent.
Thank you, Kathy.
Let's get started, Trent. We're talking a lot today, and a lot lately, in fact, about this whole concept of continuous underwriting and real-time risk assessment. From your perspective, and I want to set the stage of what this session is going to be about, what is it and how does it work? And also, how does it apply to cyber?
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. I appreciate being able to have a chance to speak with you about this. Continuous underwriting is something we at Cowbell have been anchored to since our founding in 2019. It's the idea that in a world of new developing, ever-changing risks and exposures, that at all times you're aware of what those new and developing exposures can be. So allowing for more active risk management as well as a more appropriate understanding of the risk and potential pricing discrepancies. So continuous underwriting is valuable for those who are taking on the task of assuming that risk, but equally as valuable for those who are looking to transfer that risk. The transfer of risk is not a risk-free endeavor. The downstream consequences, they can be dire from a financial, reputational, or in a business risk standpoint. But it's not just 2 sides of the same coin. It's more like multiple 3D cubes. So if you can imagine rolling the dice and the multiple consequences of what comes up, but even more so when the exposed sides are not consistent. So the exposed sides of every roll can be a brand new element added into the entire picture. Real-time assessment, continuous underwriting allows for risk mitigation, pre-incident management, more expansive loss prevention, and it can help mute the potential impacts of an exposure or a potential threat.
Can you give me an example of real-time assessment and how potentially it applies to cyber?
Yeah, so knowing in real time that a new vulnerability has surfaced, that you have that vulnerability, how the potential enterprise risk management consequences of that vulnerability could be exploited, have a lot of positive benefits for all those involved in the insurance value chain. Pre-breach mitigation, patch management, loss prevention and control can happen in real time with the validity to the reduction of that exposure. So even more specifically to cyber, cyber line of insurance really has the most to gain from a continuous risk assessment and underwriting approach. Cyber has the most exposure to new and evolving threats that can crop out of nowhere at any time. So really having a view under the hood of the profile of a risk gives exponential potential to reduce losses, and then applying that knowledge in a headlight versus a rear view mirror approach. When those threats do surface themselves, we can be made aware of those threats immediately, and there's significant advantages to addressing them in real time, not months or potentially years after the loss developments have been applied. Not only for portfolios of current business and for current policyholders, but also for the next risk that's coming in the door. Imagine being a smarter underwriter or risk manager every day because you're deploying machine learning to those new threats and risks, and you're seeing what's happening in real time, not down the road. It really takes thoughtful data science approaches, combined with actuarial science, running continuous models that identify unique risk connections between technology stacks, supply chain risks, end-of-life software, as well as emerging technologies that an organization is deploying. And what is the industry's level of security as a whole and the overall application of retentions, limits, and controls and how they interact?
So when we were preparing for this, we talked a little bit about traditional underwriting. And the challenge that you have with traditional underwriting as it relates to cyber, because you were talking a lot about the fact that the risk is continuously changing, right? So, and you're not necessarily aware, it may not be the same risk that you initially wrote at the time you closed the policy, that you put the policy on the books. Can you talk a little bit more about why the traditional approach to underwriting is no longer going to be sufficient for cyber and what you think should be there to replace it?
Yeah, absolutely. So applying traditional risk approaches to the current cyber environment and exposures, it can actually be dangerous because it can lead to policies that are really disconnected from the risks that are being covered. Essentially, at the outset, it's too slow. It doesn't account for the amount of data being created and used, and it's not embedded closely enough to those actual risks and the cybersecurity approaches of those individual risks. So attempting to adjust approaches in arrears based on historical data that may not be relevant at all, or isn't relevant as many times that data has too much of a lag to appropriately address the risk and the amount of scenarios possible that can extend from that. So continuous real-time management gives a much more expedient opportunity to address the risk, to make appropriate adjustments and prevent time leakage of that exposure. So if you're thinking about cyber risk in a historically linear fashion, it doesn't account for the space aspect of the threat landscape. So new information is being added at all times, new threats and exposures. So we at Cowbell like to think of things in really more of a space continuum rather than just a specifically time continuum.
So that has to present quite a few challenges for an underwriter to manage and to be able to keep on top of it and to actually know when to intervene and when not to. So I would expect that there are all other kinds of challenges too. So as an expert in cyber and cyber insurance, what are some of the greatest challenges that you've encountered in providing cyber insurance to your clients? And then where have the greatest exposures been found?
So in the small and mid-sized market, which is where Cowbell focuses, and probably also is where the coverage is the most needed, and also the assistance in managing that exposure is also in the most demand. We find awareness and available resources are a lot of times really challenging. So many small businesses, they think they won't be targeted, which is absolutely not the case. It's actually the opposite. 43% of cyber attacks are aimed at small to mid-sized businesses. Most don't have the basic cyber hygiene in place. They don't have the resources, let alone the security resources needed to really manage that. So we find that there's a lot of opportunity to help craft a risk transfer platform along with the policy that we're providing. And again, if we're looking at it from a continuous standpoint, there's a continuous management and an assessment of new exposures that could be presenting themselves. And that allows folks to have a priority to run their business and not always just implement security. So this is where cyber insurance providers can really provide a lot of help. First, enabling these companies to understand their risk and how does that relate to the enterprise, and then in an absolute, but also in relation to their industry peers. So where does a specific organization stack up versus their specific peers, and not as a whole, but really within their segment, within their revenue segment, within their industry segment, sometimes as well as a geographical segment. But when a business sees that they're in the bottom tier of their class for security, and maybe insurance is harder to get, this triggers a lot to someone to seek help and act on it. And we find that there's a lot of opportunity to do that.
So what advice do you have for organizations that are thinking about buying cyber, and what do you think needs to be considered that traditionally they aren't considering, as well as some advice for those who are?
Well, the first thing is this exposure and risk is becoming top of line for all of the multitude of risks that an organization faces. But every organization should just have in place basic protection that really prevents a lot of cyber attacks, including ransomware attacks. And some of this is just as basic as training. So having an employee base that understands what not to do and what to do. And some of this is just basic hygiene, and it can be difficult. But it's easy at least to implement and get a next level understanding of protection. And these should not be viewed as requirements for insurance, but just requirements to mitigate cyber threats. Some specific details are, what you're looking at for your multi-factor authentication. And there's a reason why everybody from the FBI to security pundits ask for MFA. 70 to 80% of attacks can be prevented with MFA in place. However, MFA is a pretty broad term, so you really need to understand how that relates to your organization. And your insurance and your security providers can help you do that. And why is this the case? Even if criminals are stealing usernames or passwords, they really won't be able to get into an account with just kind of some basic MFA in place. They won't have the third piece of information that only the users can get. In a lot of cases, it's free with common email services, and most systems can be enforced centrally with 1 or 2 clicks from the admin. And it's really no excuse of, I've got a workforce that doesn't get it. They'll understand it. It doesn't take long to figure it out. Backups. It's so important for specific attacks. It gives the organization options when an event does occur, but also lets you prevent and mitigate risks to prevent losses from occurring. We see more and more organizations having the appropriate backups and opting not to engage with the threat actor because it's not necessary. Again, back to employee training. 1 click on a phishing email is all it takes. And at Cowbell, for example, we help our policyholders by giving free access to that type of training and really helping understand how it relates to the cybersecurity posture. I mean, this is where you start to see a difference between maybe one-step traditional cyber insurance options versus new ones where we're fostering numerous partnerships with security vendors and a lot of other options that can give policyholders the tools they need for better security. But really at the top of the line, it's just understanding of where you are on the versus your peers, and then some of the basic steps that you can implement if you haven't already done that.
So one of the things that's on my mind and I keep thinking about is the constant changing nature of risk, right? So, one day it's email, the next day it's a hardware environment, the next day it's a software environment. If they keep changing, what recommendations do you have to help organizations more effectively mitigate risk? I heard you talk a little bit about MFA, and that's a good thing. Is there anything else that you would recommend?
Well, again, when we go back to kind of the core of what we're talking about today, continuous assessment, continuous underwriting from our standpoint, but it's also with our policyholders. So we're continuously looking at new technologies that are being implemented. When you add new users, when you add new remote folks, those are all adding to new security layers for you. So just having a continuous mitigation or a continuous assessment, and where you're always, in the war room, kind of watching what's going on is really important. And it's an interesting question, because I don't think you can accelerate innovation and enable change if your environment feels insecure. And if you bump into security challenge such as having issued things out in the marketplace for risks that you didn't know you have, which happens quite a bit. Is you've got dynamic organizations have a lot of things kind of going on in the back end. So also starting from the top and having a core focus on a correct cyber posture, that flows down through your entire organization. To go back to the topic of underwriting innovation, innovators can be across the board, even if you're not in what you feel like is an innovative organization or an industry. But we can, empower our teams to really understand why we're doing it, and some of going through some tabletop exercises to understand what it would be like if you were in a breach scenario. A lot of times, just as much as bringing someone back online and understanding the cost and the risk transfer, it's psychological, because it's not a fun place to be. It's scary. If you're not an expert, if your business isn't technology as a day-to-day basis, really understanding what's going on it can be a significant challenge. So, doing some tabletop exercises to see what that would look like gives a lot of opportunity to do some prevention.
So one of the issues that I think organizations face is the balance. What's the appropriate balance? And the nice thing about having you here today is that you've actually done 3 startups, right? So you've got the innovative mindset, but what is the appropriate balance between risk, reducing and mitigating risk versus creating a climate that fosters innovation and creativity and putting yourself out there?
Yeah, well, I've been lucky enough to be on both sides. I've been on the incumbent large organization side as an investor in startups, and also going through the startup journey as well. And you always really have to kind of draw what that line is in cyber specifically, and on the insurance side. Underwriters need to demand better data and visibility into the risks, and that having that ability will dynamically help through the underwriting process. On the policyholder side, then, being able to be open in providing what that looks like. At Cowbell, we have a connector platform where it's one-click APIs, makes it very easy for our policyholders to get some of that insight, and for our underwriters to understand what that risk looked like. That makes those decisions that you're describing much easier, because then you don't have to make a decision on weighing it, because you know exactly where you stand and you know what you do need to implement. And then you have an understanding of I am doing the best job that I can to protect my organization, to protect my my customers, my employee base. So from the way we look at it, from technology, risk signals, data, machine learning, potentially how we leverage AI, and putting that into use for the underwriting of individual accounts, and then looking at our dynamic portfolio management, really reduces the need to have to make significant trade-offs, because it shouldn't have to be a trade-off, because you would need to have both a posture of basic hygiene, as well as risk transfer. And if you kind of put it into real world terms, if you think about, if you get into a vehicle, when you feel safe in a vehicle, and you're not making the trade-off typically between I'm not going to feel safe and I'm still going to drive, or kind of those risk factors. Those are things that are embedded into everyday life. And if you kind of relate that to what you're doing from a cyber standpoint, you may feel like, well, I don't really have to make those. I don't have to make those trade-offs. I can be secure, but and also be innovative, and also be extend what I want to do from a business perspective.
So we're all in budgeting season right now, thinking about next year and beyond, and trying to figure out what do we need to put into our operating plans. Do you have any words of wisdom on an appropriate percentage? And I know it all depends, but a percentage of what we ought to be investing in cyber and risk mitigation.
So for most organizations, they need to increase their spend in security, and they may have to be increasing their spend in insurance, especially if they haven't increased their spend in security. Now, the nice thing that we're seeing is that there's lower expenses in certain other areas. So it may not always be an additional spend from the overall entire organization. But what is happening in the market is that the people who are willing to take on the risk transfer are being more diligent about how they're looking at the risk that they're taking on. So, again, if we take it back to, if you're insuring a building, typically no one is against having someone look at that building and understand that it's in good shape before they take on that risk, and that if it's not in good shape, that you may have to spend more from an insurance standpoint. And cyber is no different.
I think that's a really good point for us to wrap up on, because it isn't. You've got to maintain your software. You've got to maintain your systems if you want them to work, just like any other asset that you have. So with that, I want to say thank you so very much. This has been really interesting, and I'm fascinated by some of the concepts that you're proposing, and they are innovative, and we certainly appreciate you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.